All right, so this is a sheep brain. This is the anterior portion. This is the posterior portion. This is the dorsal side. This is the ventral side. What you see as far as this covering is actually the outer layer of the meninges. This is the dura mater. It is translucent, right? You can kind of see through it to the underlying layer. Not completely transparent, but it is a layer of connective tissue that protects then the underlying brain. So we're going to need to cut that away in order to see some of these underlying structures. So while separating the dura mater from the spinal cord and the brain, we came upon the denticulate ligaments here on either side, the whole way down the spinal cord they would be found, and they're extensions of the pia mater that come out and connect then to the arachnoid mater that help to anchor the spinal cord from side to side. But there you can see a nice sample of the denticulate ligaments. Externally, so we're looking at the dorsal surface of the brain. This is the cerebrum here. This whole unit is the cerebrum. And then the cerebellum, the little brain. And this is then the spinal cord at the bottom. We'll look at the brain stem, which we can see better on the ventral side. So the shiny surface that you see that looks kind of painted or shellacked, that's the pia mater. Okay. So we have cerebrum, cerebellum, little brain. I'm going to flip this over. So this whole section right here is the medulla. And then this little cross section here is the pons. So medulla kind of starts here and goes to about there, and there you can see the spinal cord then, this narrowed section. Pons is this little bridge that's about half an inch wide, maybe. And then this whole section here is the midbrain. So these three sections make up the brain stem. So some landmarks here we can look at. The cerebral hemispheres, and this is our longitudinal fissure, it's called, and it separates the left cerebrum from the right cerebrum. And then we have the transverse fissure, which easily opens thanks to removing then part of the dura mater, that falx cerebelli, which is an extension of the dura mater, that once we remove that outer layer, this separates very nicely. But this portion that separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum is the transverse fissure, very deep groove. Longitudinal fissure separates the cerebral hemispheres, left and right. Now, all these little folded, raised areas of tissue, they're called gyri, multiples, gyrus for one. And then where you can see the blood vessels lying in, those little depressions, very shallow ones, those are the singular sulcus, plural sulci. The lobes of the brain, which are the same for sheep as they are for humans. Up front here is the frontal lobe, right? This would be your parietal lobes here on top. In the very back here, occipital lobes. And then on the side here, temporal lobes. This part that dips down, temporal lobe on each side. So each hemisphere has a portion of each of the lobes. Frontal, parietal, occipital, and then temporal that dips down there. These are the olfactory bulbs, and olfactory, this is for the first cranial nerve, and they are for smell. An extension of the olfactory bulbs are the tracts. So these are the axons, right? The bundles of axons then that will extend from the sensory portion of the olfactory bulb. Okay? That connects then with the sensors in the top of the nose. These long structures are the optic nerves. And if you notice very carefully, right here, they crisscross. So this right one will come in, because we flipped it over, the right one will come in and cross, the left crosses. And where it crosses in the center, it's called the optic chiasm, where the two optic nerves cross, the optic chiasm. So just behind here would be where the infundibulum is. What the infundibulum is, it's a connection between the hypothalamus, deep inside, which we'll take a look at once we do a cut, and the pituitary gland. So the infundibulum is the stalk, and it's right behind the optic chiasm, and it holds the pituitary gland. Now, pituitary is missing, so we don't have that to look at, but that lies right behind, that's been removed, because it's not contained within the dura mater. It hangs below. But the infundibulum right behind. And then right behind that, this bump here is called the mammillary body. And in sheep, as what we're looking at right now, the mammillary body is much bigger than it is in humans. And that's because they have a sharper sense. It's for smell, because I understand that they can't see as well. So smell helps to protect them. So they have a larger mammillary body that helps them with as a protective mechanism. Okay. So again, back to this whole portion here is part of the midbrain, which is the top of the brain stem. Then we have this little bridge here, this lighter colored structure. If I remove some of the tissue there, you'll be able to see. So this area here is the pons, and then right here where it rounds out, this is the medulla oblongata. And then this terminal portion is the spinal cord that exits from there. Okay, so to review, olfactory bulbs, and then the olfactory tracts, they extend from the optic nerves, and where they cross in the center, optic chiasm, right behind that infundibulum, and this large area in the center, the mammillary body. Okay, pituitary is removed, but it would be hanging from the infundibulum, but because it's been removed, we cannot see it, of course. A couple more structures here before we take a cut. Okay, so as I open up here, we're getting a posterior view, right? You'll see some structures here as we look deep. This section right here, where there's two larger rounded portions and two flatter portions underneath, are combined called the tectum, or the corpora quadrigemina. The two upper structures are called superior colliculi. The two bottom ones are called inferior colliculi. Superior colliculi helps with tracking, so it has to do with vision, things that you see, either movable or immovable objects. So you're watching something move with your eyes, or your eyes are moving across a page as you're reading a sentence. It is the superior colliculi that help with that visual tracking. The lower two structures, the inferior colliculi, are associated with sound, and kind of loud sounds like surprise, right? Changes in volume. So the bottom ones are with sound and hearing. The top ones are with vision. Together they are called either the tectum or the corpora quadrigemina. Quad is in four different structures. Just above that, very deep in there, you will see a structure that's part of what we call the epithalamus. It's the pineal gland, and it comes to a point there. You see the very tip right here, closest to us, and it sits on top of the corpora quadrigemina. And the pineal gland has to do with sleeping, right? Regulating melatonin, the release of melatonin and sleep. So that's the pineal gland there. There, that's a good view. Okay, so again, this is the pineal gland, part of the epithalamus, regulating sleep, releases melatonin, sits on top of the corpora quadrigemina, which are these four structures: superior, inferior. Superior colliculi, visual tracking. Inferior colliculi, the change in sounds or reacting to a surprise sound, like the startle reflex, being surprised by a sound you don't expect, startle. So that's the inferior colliculi. All right, we're gonna do a flip here. So this is the cerebellum. Shortly we'll do a flip. This is the cerebellum, and this central portion, so these are the lobes here, the two sides. This central portion is called the vermes, like a worm, and it looks kind of like a worm. It's kind of like this long round section that's in the center of the cerebellum, or what we call the little brain. Okay. I'm just going to follow the longitudinal fissure, which is there for us to separate the hemispheres, and we're going to make a mid-sagittal cut. This is very pliable structure, so it's going to cut really easily right down through the middle. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to cut right down through the middle of the cerebellum, or close to the middle. Didn't do a great job there, but finish cutting there a little bit. Okay. So some more structures to identify here. I'm going to look here at the cerebellum, and you'll notice that the cerebellum has a white part with a gray outer part. And where it's white, it looks like a tree. See that? It's called the arbor vitae, and arbor vitae is a type of tree. And so they named it after how an actual tree looks. So this is the white matter in the center, and around it is the gray matter, and that's to represent the leaves, or what technical term is folia, which also means leaves. So the gray matter is the folia, the white matter is called the arbor vitae. Okay, so we have two ventricles on the top. There are 4 total ventricles that make and then help to circulate cerebrospinal fluid. So the 2 at the top, right here is one on this half that we've cut. And there are little cells. See, see the purple there? That's blood vessels, and that's from the blood vessels, the little ependymal cells. Oh, there's a nice blood vessel, like the capillaries, and our little ependymal cells are attached there, and they filter then the cerebrospinal fluid, make it from the blood. So they're up in there on the roof of the lateral ventricle. To separate where the two, because the two halves here come together, and to separate each ventricle so they can hold the fluid, is a piece of tissue. And mine's kind of disintegrating here, but this tissue that covers along the whole length of the lateral ventricle is called the septum pellucidum, and it separates the halves. Now, if we're gonna name these structures below and on top of the ventricles. So this one here that's like a hook, see that there? It starts down here and it comes around the top. Very big, very broad. It's called the corpus callosum, very famous white matter tract that connects the two halves, the two hemispheres of the cerebrum, the corpus callosum. Underneath is another structure called the fornix. So this under the lateral ventricle is the fornix. On top, makes the little hook there and goes around, is the corpus callosum. Now, underneath the fornix, this area here is where, and look at that, what do we have here? More capillaries and ependymal cells. This is where the third ventricle lies. And it's on top of this round structure here, very large round structure. That's the thalamus. This rounded structure, see the circle? That's the thalamus. Below the thalamus would be the hypothalamus here, and then the pituitary infundibulum, which we only have that little piece there, but the infundibulum would hang, and then the pituitary would be down here. So thalamus, on top of the thalamus is the epithalamus that we peeked at from behind. This is the superior colliculi, the top of the corpora quadrigemina. So corpus callosum, lateral ventricle with the ependymal cells inside. Fornix, third ventricle, which is on top of the thalamus, under the fornix. Thalamus, hypothalamus, infundibulum, where the pituitary would be hanging from. Pineal gland, superior colliculi, and then inferior colliculi, and then here's that transverse fissure. Now, see if I can find the last structure. This is messy because this is kind of falling apart. Right here, this is the pathway that the fluid takes. So it follows, right, comes down, and in here is the fourth ventricle that goes into the cerebellum. So the fourth ventricle. So we have two lateral ventricles, a third ventricle, and a fourth ventricle is how they're named. And then this will come down and go through the central canal of the spinal cord.